there is nothing we can do about them. They were constructed at one time. We can deconstruct them now and construct new empowering identities. So for me, those have been the sort of principles that have guided my work, the issue of integration, the issue of internationalization, the issue of interdisciplinarity, and the issue of interculturalism.
Thank you, Paul. I'm just so I couldn't wait to interpolate because what you've said is so central to becoming contemporary Africans. You know, and it is an issue that I really am very, very concerned about, that we're not having the discussion as deeply and as extensively as possible. And Paul's work really is a major stepping stone to thinking about ourselves as Africans in the new ways that we need to adopt. Understanding our history, who we are, where we come from, not as these solid units in time and space, you know, but really thinking about ourselves critically in relation to who we are in the world, where we've been. For example, Africans were living in Halifax, Nova Scotia, long before the slaving. We had trading relationships with First Nation people in the north of Canada. And the evidence is there. But most Africans don't know this. The only narrative that most of us know, and in fact many people on the continent don't know enough about it, is that Africans were enslaved, that we were dragged across the Atlantic Ocean. By the way, both oceans that hug our continent are named for everything else but Africa. I mean, how can you name an ocean the Indian Ocean? Where's India? India is a small little country in South Asia. Why is an ocean that hugs a whole continental shelf of our continent called the Indian Ocean? I mean, have we thought about this? And the implications of this? You know, it's very disturbing. The colonization was not only on the landmass of the continent, the names, the rivers, the lakes, etc., but even in the bounding and shrinking of Africa's territory, which Paul has just spoken about, that, you know, the definition of Africa is minimalist. And so minimalist that we even now reduced to sub-Saharan Africa. I mean, look at this. That's 2/3 of the continent is gone. So this process of erasure and bounding and shrinking, you know, requires that we reinterpret and resituate who we are in the world in the new ways that Paul is doing. Personally, I don't call it the Indian Ocean, I call it the African Ocean. And I also don't call the falls that border Zimbabwe and Zambia, I don't call them the Victoria Falls. I mean, how outrageous and obnoxious is that? But I call them the Zambezi Falls, Musiotunya. You know, there are names for these places. But what it does is that when we reclaim the names, when we retrieve the names, we expand Africa, you see. We expand the notion of Africa. We retrieve it and expand it and do what Paul has been doing in his work. So for those of you who are historians in this community today, you know, the urgency of doing this is so, so, so critical. Because, yeah, it is our time. It's not just about Africa rising because the colonials have the new technology, you know, to strip us of whatever remains using the satellites, you know. But we have to rise. If we're going to use that rhetoric, we have to rise in the new ways that require that we retell and resituate our narrative. So I want to just ask Paul another quick question. And the question is related to Pan-Africanism. Because often we think about Pan-Africanism as though it is something that's invented in the late 20th century, late 19th century, early 20th century, Marcus Garvey. You know, it's usually males. And also, you know, is situated outside of the continent. So these Caribbean and North American geniuses met in England, happened to bump into Kwame Nkrumah and them, and then they invented this politics which became very central to our liberation struggles. It's a very narrow exclusionary notion. It's very important, it's very powerful, but it's very limited. So your very complex and very fascinating treatment of the diaspora, what you've just shared with us, what implications do you think this reconceptualization, this situation, I mean, resituating the notion of the diaspora in an epistemology, you know, that is so tremendously expansive. What do you think the implications could be for Pan-Africanism?
Once again, a really wonderful question.
I'm having fun.
Patricia mentioned something absolutely profound, namely that before we even talk about Pan-Africanism, what is Africa? Who is African? Because we cannot define Pan-Africa without understanding that question. And I'll just give you a couple of examples, elaborating on the point I made earlier. If we think of Africa as sub-Saharan Africa, we're going to get a very different understanding of Pan-Africanism. If we think of Africa as the entire continent, we're going to get a very different understanding of the politics and other forms of Pan-African possibility in terms of engagement. Let me just give you two examples elaborating on something she said. When you read history books, they will tell you that the Moors or Muslims or Arabs, and nobody says Africans, conquered the Iberian Peninsula in 711. And they're going to rule the Iberian Peninsula in parts and pieces until 1492, when they're going to be thrown out. Who were these Moors? By 711, there had not been many quote-unquote Arab migrations to what we call North Africa. These were Africans from not only northwestern Africa, they came from as far as what we call West Africa today. Because of very complicated historical formations of kingdoms in that part of the world. They went on to conquer that. So part of my diaspora research was to go to Spain to deconstruct the idea, who are the Spanish, who then went to conquer the Americas. Yeah. Who were they? And Patricia mentioned this idea of Africans dealing with native peoples in the Americas. The first person of African descent to, at least recorded, to arrive in what is today Canada was somebody called Da Costa. He arrived there in 1604, and he was black. He was from Portugal. The Iberian Peninsula had peoples of African descent for a long time. So the question is, by raising the map of Africa, understanding the map of Africa differently, we begin to reinterpret not only African history, but European history. The other point in terms of example, Africans, through the African Ocean, the Indian Ocean, had been trading, moving back and forth between the Eastern African landmass and the Arabian Peninsula and the Indian subcontinent for a very long time. So for part of my research, I also went to India. And I remember going deep into the countryside. And there were these communities of African descent who had never met somebody from the continent. And one of the most fascinating things for me was, these are Indians. They're Hindus, they're Muslims, or they're Christians, they're Indians. Was that surreptitious looking at themselves, looking at me? It's like, he looks like us, but he's not us. And it was absolutely fascinating. migrations of Africans to India have been going on since at least the 13th century. In fact, there were African kingdoms in India. If you go to India now, Indian historians are doing this. Indian historians that do that kind of history no longer regard that as a revelation. There were these kingdoms that were established by some famous generals from Ethiopia fighting against the Mughals. And I remember going to the New Delhi Museum, and the director of the New Delhi Museum, the first thing he said to me, this was in 2009, and that's why he said what I'm going to tell you. He said to me, there have been many Obamas in India. What he meant is there have been many rulers of African descent in Indian history. So it begins to change not only our understanding of our own history, but also understanding of Indian history. And therefore, it begins to change how we conceive Pan-Africanism. Let me just make two very quick points about Pan-Africanism. Pan-Africanism has had the analytical frame of Pan-Africanism has suffered from two major problems. One is that many of us don't quite unpack the different projects in Pan-Africanism carefully. There are at least 6 different versions of Pan-Africanism, each of which has very different implications for how that project leads itself to fruition. One is the transatlantic Pan-Africanism, which is attributed to the Pan-African Congresses, beginning with Sylvester Williams in 1901, then the Du Boisian Congresses, you name it, ending in 1945 in Manchester, and of course the attempts to revive them in Tanzania in 1974, and things like that, that sort of transatlantic Pan-Africanism. There is another version, which is the Black Atlantic version, which ignores Africa, and that is represented by the work of Paul Gilroy, in which Africa is a silent present. This is where the Africans came to the Americas. Once they come, you don't talk about Africa anymore. So Africa is not the focus of Gilroy, except to say, yeah, they came from there. And it becomes, in fact, Gilroy has more problems than that. It becomes also a narrative of Anglo-centric conceit, because he really looks at the African-American diaspora, and not just the African-American diaspora, which is smaller than the Afro-Brazilian diaspora, but also the ones who went to England and got their light, civilizational light in England. So, and it's a very Merocentric narrative, to get to your point about the gendered nature of these narratives of that, transatlantic, sort of the Black Atlantic version. Then there is the sub-Saharan notion of Pan-Africanism. Black people unite type of Pan-Africanism. The authenticities type of stuff. And some of the representatives of that were some of the West African dictators. Mobutu, authenticity. He became Nguza, whatever, that long name, the chickens or the cock, whatever. So that notion of black unity and that kind of stuff. And again, it separates itself, reduces itself to the sub-Saharan contraption of Eurocentric construction. But they think they're being progressive, when in fact they're being very backward. And then there is the continental version of Pan-Africanism, which actually triumphed politically, because that's the one that led to the formation of the Organization of African Unity, the predecessor of the AU, and that one was contesting both the transatlantic. It ignored the transatlantic. It definitely also ignored the Black Atlantic, which obviously had no impact for Africa, and it was also contesting the sub-Saharan. So that's the fourth one. The fifth one, in my view, is what we have to regard as global Pan-Africanism. And for me, global Pan-Africanism has to be looking at Africa's engagements, the interactions of African peoples globally. And that's why my research project was very carefully choosing countries in South America. As I said, the largest African diaspora is in Brazil. President Lula used to claim that Brazil is, in fact, Africa's second largest country after Nigeria in terms of population. Of course, he did that to ingratiate himself with African politicians, but there was a truth to that. Just a little aside, when the former President Bush was not well known for his being educated, asked Condoleezza Rice, who was his Secretary of State, when they were visiting Brazil, asked her, "Are there black people in this country?" And Condoleezza Rice said, "Yes, Mr. President, more than in America." And that itself is problematic because America is not just the United States. The whole South and North, they're America, but the US has appropriated that. So if we're going to have a Pan-Africanism that is truly claiming Africa's place in the world, it has to be global, because our people are global. Our people are in Asia, our people are in Europe, our people are in the Americas. If you're in the United States, those of you who are from the United States who know, or who have worked or lived in the United States, will know that people assume there is this notion of Latinos and Hispanics as being different from people of African descent, forgetting that the vast majority of African descended peoples are in Latin America, and 1/4 of Latinos are people of African descent. So the notion that Latinos are overtaking the black population in the US is based on a very racist construct of what Latin America is all about. And we have to claim globality in terms of Pan-Africanism. Let me just close that by saying one other point. We have tended to focus, when it comes to Pan-Africanism, on the politics of Pan-Africanism, on political movements, on political engagements, on political relationships. That's obviously important, but that is very limiting in understanding the full complexity, diversity of diaspora engagements. And in my work, I look at, in addition to the political movements and engagements, which, as I've said there, you can also subdivide them, I look at other areas. One is demographic movements. There have been very complicated movements in the Pan-African world for a very long time. I'll just give you one example. We all know about the foundation, quote unquote, of Sierra Leone and Liberia. What people don't realize, black sailors in the Atlantic world were moving all over the Atlantic world. Some of them settled as far as South Africa in the 18th century. So it's a very complicated story. So demographic movements, not only during the era of the slave trade, but also demographic movements since modern times. In the last 40 years, more Africans, for example, have been arriving in the United States than they were arriving during the time of the slave trade. So demographic movements, we have to look at them in their complexities very, very carefully. I'll give you one really fascinating story I heard when I was in Brazil. And that was, there was a king of Dahomey, as it was called at that time, whose mother had been sold into slavery. And during the sort of royal struggle in the late 18th century, and then when this guy was able to become the king of Dahomey, he sent a delegation to Brazil to look for his mother. And it's a fascinating story. And he found the mother, and the mother was taken back to Benin. In Brazil, there was a famous Islamic rebellion in 1834, the Mali Rebellion. And after that rebellion, the rebels, quote unquote, were deported or self-deported to West Africa. And many of them reconstructed the histories of coastal West Africa, the Saros and what have you in Nigeria and so on. Tade Aina, for example, will tell you his great-great-grandmother is from that Brazilian origin. So there are movements back and forth